Welcome to Introducing Intervention into the Chaordic Construction Environment. We're glad you're here. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be co-moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Our co-moderator today is Dr. Catherine Brookman, Associate Director, Knowledge Transfer and Exchange in the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders. Catherine, you will be moderating our Q&A session, and I will let you introduce our presenters, Dr. Philip Bigelow and PhD candidate Nicolette Carlon.
Thank you, Yursa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us and for WWDPI for collaborating on this construction webinar series. CRE-MSD is grateful to the Ministry of Labour for their funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and of course to our presenters who provide their expertise. We do encourage you to fill out an evaluation after the presentation so that we can adjust our planning and delivery of these webinars to better suit your needs. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our two presenters today. Our first presenter is Nicolette Carlon, who is a PhD candidate and project coordinator at the University of Waterloo. She is completing her dissertation on the path from science to workplace change. She holds an MES from York University and an MA in sociology from the University of Windsor. Nikki has published with the research team and independently about the relationship between work organization, specifically lean production, and occupational health. Previously, Nikki chaired the Occupational Ontario Disease Panel and was vice chair at the Ontario Workplace Safety and Insurance Tribunal and the executive director of the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers. Thank you so much, Nikki, for being part of this today. Our second presenter is Dr. Phil Bigelow. He is an associate professor in the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo, where he is also a CRE-MSD researcher with a background in occupational epidemiology. Phil holds an appointment at the Institute for Work and Health, where he is a specialist in program evaluation and intervention studies. He was a faculty member in the Department of Environmental Health at Colorado State University for over 10 years, where he conducted research in exposure assessment, occupational epidemiology, and construction health and safety. He held a NIOSH Mentored Research Scientist Development Award in which he studied exposures and health effects in construction painters. He led a NIOSH research project that evaluated HomeSafe, which is a novel residential construction safety program involving a partnership of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Denver. Wow, what expertise we have here. So I just want to tell you a couple of things about CRE-MSD, and then I will hand it over to our two presenters. So for those of you who have not heard or don't know of CRE-MSD, in a nutshell, it is a research-based center that works with multiple industry sectors and partners with industry and academics to design, execute, and evaluate research specifically to help the prevention of MSDs. So CRE-MSD's goals are to conduct research and then to translate this research into knowledge that organizations, industries can use to make a difference in the workplace related to musculoskeletal injuries. And how we do that, if you look at the next slide, you will see there are a couple of ways CRE-MSD does that. We carry out, as you know, webinars like today. We host conferences that are probably the most reasonable conferences I'm aware of in terms of price, where we bring in people to give you real case studies in industry on how research has been used and made a difference. We build capacity of organizations to prevent MSDs by getting them to participate in research and understanding how they can integrate it into their workplace processes. We provide grants for bringing researchers and industry together. And we have a very interactive website, a new website also called MSD Prevention, that provides information, research, position papers, all kinds of videos and fact sheets to help you take relevant current information and move it into your organization. So without further ado, and thank you for that commercial opportunity on CRE-MSD, I'd like to hand it over to Nikki.
Hello. I thought that we would start off by introducing this webinar as sort of a journey of what we learned during a multi-year program investigating innovations into the construction sector. And we're here prepared to tell you what we did right and what we did wrong, what we learned and how we could do it better. So we're going to go through 3 case studies over the course of this program and explain some of our successes and some of our barriers to introducing innovations into the construction sector. As I've said, this was a multi-year program basically spanning close to 10 years. We identified a number of companies that were willing to try certain projects with us, a hydraulic lift or rack, and Phil will be explaining that program in a bit. We identified other innovative tools, some of which were successfully implemented, others not. And then we developed a certain expertise in disseminating innovative ideas across the construction sector. We did a special project on plumbing with the new PEX plumbing piping, and Phil will talk about that. And we did a very small but important intervention into micro and small workplaces. Our research team was collaborative in all ways. We worked collectively with the Construction Safety Association of Ontario, which is now part of the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association. We had several members of their staff, Enzo Garitano, Peter Vai, and Marek Plawinski, who worked with us, as well as the CRE staff of Richard Wells, myself, Dee Kramer, and Phil Bigelow, Jan Marshall, Bettina Butler, and Rebecca Mayer. I should also have put on the slide, which I did not do, and recognition that we worked with UA, a local, the United Plumbers Union, with its local in Toronto, and we worked diligently with those people. Why we chose construction as a special focus of our research is an important thought. Construction has always been under-researched in an interesting way, because for researchers, it there's problems in researching construction. It's very difficult to follow up with people because workers move from one work one employer to another. So you don't have a continuum to see what's happening with their health and safety. And it's difficult to identify a specific process because in construction, as I'll talk about in a bit, workers have a lot of control over the work process. So identifying how work is being done and to follow it is difficult because people do things in different ways. It's also important to note that 1.2 million Canadian workers are employed in the construction sector, but most of them are employed by small companies, which is another issue that we'll talk about later, but makes it difficult to follow them up for any kind of research. And the other thing from our perspective, from the CRE perspective, is that 35% of all lost time injuries in the construction sector and in most sectors are related to musculoskeletal disorders. And so it's not the major accident, it's the progressive ongoing disabilities that we see affecting people's ability to work and costing workers money, employers money, and a lot of pain and grief. So today we're going to learn a little bit about the theoretical perspectives on work organization and knowledge. We're going to look at 3 case studies, ladder racks, plumbing, and stored off the floor. And then we'll talk about what we learned that can hopefully help you in your endeavors to innovate important techniques in the workplace. To begin with, it's important to understand that manufacturing and construction are significantly different. Manufacturing is an example of a traditional workplace. The work is continuous. You hire people, you keep them on staff. People work with the same workmates. The workplace is fixed so that they're going to the same place every day. And if you need to modify or reorganize the work site, you can do it. The supervision is linear, and so there's this foreman, maybe a team leader, and then workers. The employment status is primarily permanent. People are lucky when they get hired on. For example, in the car plants, if you get your 90 days in, you're there. The education is primarily employer provided by the employers, so health and safety training or even skill training is often provided by the employer. And the pay system is hourly with benefits. So it's a much more rigid, controlled environment. Construction, in contrast, is project-driven work. The workmates are changing constantly so that you don't have the same relationship you have with the colleagues that you have in say, a factory. The workplace is transient. So obviously you're going from workplace to workplace. And the supervision is complex in construction. Oftentimes the supervisor, the foreman, is somebody sent out by the union who's designated a foreman over a certain job site. And his next job site, he might in fact be a laborer. And so the designation is determined by the union as to who is the lead or the supervisor in the workplace. And that changes the relationship between workers and management. The workforce is often mixed, contingent, and permanent. And I think that we need to remember that over 30% of the workers in Ontario, at least, are contingent workers. They have working on contract with no permanent employment. In the construction field, it's primarily skilled trades. So people who have some kind of apprenticeship have pride in the fact that they're a skilled tradesperson and come to the workplace with a set of standards that they developed outside of the workplace. Now, this work is usually hourly, and there's a benefit for premium or piecework, which also affects health and safety. So manufacturing is much more rigid than construction, and that impacts how innovation is introduced into the workplace. The other thing that's very important in terms of introducing innovation into a workplace is the notion of open versus closed networks. An open network is a construction site where there's a whole bunch of people who have different skill sets, don't really know each other, come together for a certain period of time, and then they leave each other. There's very few rules about how you get to be a member on a work site. So the contractor will hire a whole bunch of subs. And if you're one of the subcontractors, you're part of this open network, but you didn't have to join a club or pay dues or anything else to be part of that. And what makes open networks important in innovation is that they're open to change and they're open to new ideas, because they're seeing people come together from different places where they would not normally have shared experiences. So it's not simply a group of plumbers. It's a group of plumbers with a bunch of bricklayers, with electricians who all come with different experiences to a work site. Closed networks are experience restricted membership, and they're bound by tradition, and they have a traditional goal. Closed networks are very important in terms of knowledge transfer, because they have a lot of capital for the people that are part of the network. The problem with closed networks in terms of innovations is that tradition is very important to their identity. And so when you're trying to innovate or change rules, you have to buck against the traditional way of doing work. So it's important that you can see as broad a spectrum of people when you're trying to introduce innovations. The other thing that's important in terms of innovations is the different forms of knowledge. People have described these in different ways, but I'll just go through some. There's structural knowledge, which is the most formal kind of knowledge that you have. It's explicit and it's rule-driven. The benefit of structural knowledge is that you know what the rules are. And but the barrier or the adverse consequence of structural knowledge is that it's difficult to change. So you can see how long it takes for a piece of health and safety legislation to be introduced, and then you have to negotiate the terms of the regulation, blah, 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 blah. It can take a very long time. With cognitive knowledge, which is less rigid than structural knowledge, people come to know things because they have a shared language, and they share an identity and a social set of social cohesion. And it's effective for complex knowledge. Cognitive knowledge is what you get after you've completed your apprenticeship. So you share certain bits of information, you share techniques of doing certain kinds of work, and you share certain goals. Experiential knowledge, the final form of knowledge I wanted to talk about, is knowledge that you get from experience. Simple as that. And personal relationships are very important in terms of developing and sharing experiential knowledge. Oftentimes, I always say that if I got stuck in the highway, I'd much rather have a mechanic than a PhD engineer to help me get my car started again. And it's that kind of basic knowledge that we look for in our tradespeople, people who have done the same thing and have learned to modify their activities in such a way to be able to conduct the work effectively. If you share experiential knowledge with your colleagues, you create strong ties, and one person who you share knowledge with is a good mentor for introducing new ideas, because you trust them, because you trust that they know how to have done the job, they've done the job for years, and you have confidence in their abilities. So we have diverse kinds of workplaces, we have diverse kinds of knowledge, and what we originally did was try to find different kinds of innovations in the workplace that would allow us to reduce musculoskeletal disabilities. And on this slide, I've got a couple of pictures. One is the ladder rack that Phil is going to talk to you about. And the other one is a rebar tying machine. Now, you would think that this would be a a slam dunk innovation because you don't have to bend over to tie the rebar before you pour cement on a concrete slab. The problem is that the rebar tying machine de-skills workers, and so there was a big backlash among the union representing rebar tyers because they were afraid that their value would be de-skilled, their hourly rate would be de-skilled, and there would not be as much work for them. This machine is available and is used often, but is still not widely accepted by the trade. So we have different things to consider when trying to introduce different innovations. Now I'm going to turn it over to Phil, who's going to talk to you about the ladder racks.
So yes, thanks, Nikki. It's Phil Bigelow here, the second presenter. Nikki will be coming back in a few minutes after I talk about a couple of case studies. So before getting started, I'd really like to thank Nikki for, she's the one that's been on all these projects throughout this program of research for CRE-MSD, in construction. She's like the glue that has, kept us all together through all the years, and it's been as Nikki said, it's been, at least 10 years we've been doing work in construction, and we're still doing it now. Other people, there's a list of references at the back of the presentation that you'll see kind of at the end and when you download the presentation later on. But I'd like to thank also those folks. I know Nikki already mentioned them, but, Desiree Kramer is a KTE specialist, and she was with CRE-MSD for a number of years and really brings us the theory behind these things, along with Nikki as well. But those guys provide us the background so that, when we're trying to do these interventions and trying to get this stuff out in the sector, that there's a good theoretical basis for it. And I'll talk a bit about that on this particular case study here. And also, Peter Vai, who was the ergonomist at CSAO, he's still an ergonomist, but as Nikki has mentioned, the Construction Safety Association of Ontario is now the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association. But Peter has been a proponent of improving, the working lives of people in construction for many years, and this is really a passion for him. And really, his focus is a lot on tools. Tools in construction, if you could change the tools. And this project that we're talking about here is a lot about tools. Get the right tool in the hands of the right people, and it'll spread around. And Nikki also mentioned Enzo Garantino. He's the head now of also a predominant player in all these construction projects. He's now in charge of IHSA, along with of course, Richard Wells, who everybody in ergonomics and MSD prevention knows. Another person on these projects is Marcus Young, who worked with us quite a bit on the plumbing project that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes here. So in terms of these two case studies, the first one is this ladder lift, and the reference is down there, and you can see it later. But so in terms of what happened, this is really, all these projects are, as Nikki mentioned, are really collaborative adventures, these things. And the Construction Safety Association or Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, that they're key players in these things. They're the intermediaries between the researchers and folks on the ground. So again, key folks, and they also have the infrastructure as well. I don't want to, it's the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, but they have that infrastructure that in the sectors. And for example, this hydraulic ladder lift, the reason why we did it was because there was a concern from a committee of CSAO. These are labor management committees that are set up through the Health and Safety Association. And so one of them is the Refrigerator and Air Conditioning Health and Safety Association. So this is a group of people from the sector in construction that come together, and their goal is to promote safety in the sector through the province. They identified that their workers have an issue with upper body musculoskeletal disorders and back pain because of this task of lifting ladders onto the trucks seen in the picture here. Especially the vans and trucks are getting bigger and bigger, higher and higher, and it's a lot of work to lift these ladders on top of these racks. So the solution here, well, one solution is, and this was the job of this Labor Management Health and Safety Committee, was to identify solutions, and they identified this hydraulic ladder lift as a potential solution. And so we did some evaluations of it. You know, Peter's the ergonomist. He worked with Richard Wells up here at the University of Waterloo and did a biomechanical assessment of the ladder lift, comparing it to the standard practice of lifting these ladders on top of the roof. And there was significant reductions in a bunch of risk factors for MSDs, including spinal compression. So this actually biomechanically works in terms of potential for reducing MSDs in these workers. So the next step as part of the project is, well, okay, the decision was made by the team. Again, it's the team approach that Nikki talked about. Researchers and practitioners all together to do something about MSDs in the sector. The idea here is this project is really a knowledge translation and exchange project, a KTE project. We purchased ladder lifts for the project through the WSIB, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, who are the sponsors of this research project. So the idea the other thing I should note is when we're thinking about innovations, we're looking for new innovations, the ones that are not already diffused throughout the sector. Because we do want to make an impact on MSDs. If half the people are already using it, well, maybe that's not the best thing to introduce. We want to introduce something that's going to make a change and be taken up by folks in the sector. So this one had really low diffusion. Well, it had low uptake right at the beginning. People didn't know much about it. But it does have the potential to reduce MSDs. So we purchase these things, and the idea is get people to use it, and we do everything we can to get this in the hands of people who will use it. And also the idea behind this KTE project was we use these theoretical approaches here, and these are based on the theory of diffusion innovation of Rogers, and also the social interactionist model. In terms of the framework for this thing. And the approach here is to identify opinion leaders, because these are the people who have the most capacity to diffuse new innovations in these industries, in these sectors. And there's quite a bit of research showing that this is the way to do it. So we identified opinion leaders by surveying companies, and so construction managers and people who went to these meetings, in the sector. And when there was the approach was a bunch of surveys went out to companies. If a company was identified by 3 different people independently, they're kind of seen as they're likely a true opinion leader. So we contacted 30 of these opinion leaders, and it ended up that 13 of them adopted this new innovation, where we provided them the ladders and did a little bit of training, and they go out and be these opinion leaders to hopefully get this thing diffused throughout the sector. So we did all that. That makes a lot of sense, to make sure that these things are ergonomically effective. And the other thing actually we did also too was talk to workers, of course, and we did surveys of workers in terms of their, the feasibility of use. Does this thing work for them, and what does it do for workers? So that was part of this evidence that went into the selection of the innovation. Actually, that kind of happened at the same time as as other parts of the project. We already knew that it's got biological plausibility, and this just confirmed that it's the right thing to do. So basically, what happened was, once folks went out, and one thing we found from workers was that when workers were on site on construction sites with this new ladder lift, that people liked it. They thought, hey, that's pretty cool. You guys got this new thing, and they not only told people about it, people would come and ask them, where did you get that that lift from? Because we have trouble putting these ladders on top of our trucks as well. And so that was kind of content validity from the workers. And also when we talked to companies as well, we did a survey later on of companies, and many of the companies that we talked to would consider buying these new ladder lifts, this new innovation, the next time they were in the market for buying either a new truck where they put a new a rack on there, or a new rack itself. Given the opportunity, they would do that. So this slide shows some more of the results. 30 companies approached, 13 did adopt the innovation. There was some limited participation, and here the slide talks about few accidents. Well, it's kind of a little complicated. Basically, what we found was these 13 companies, more of them were small and medium-sized workplaces. And we're thinking, are those the people that really are, they were opinion leaders in the sector, but why are they the ones that pick up on this research project and agree to be kind of leaders and promote this new innovation? Well, one of the reasons is that in a larger company, you have more bureaucracy to get things in the company itself. So, the research team providing them, one of these things, if you have 200 trucks, that's not that many. You've outfitted one of 200. Well, that's good, but if workers like it, then you have to buy 199 more. So that's going to cost, and these things cost about, I think it was $1,300 Canadian, that would be, and a few $100s to have them installed, and plus having the truck out of service for like 4 hours or a day or something to get it installed. It is a cost, so this, saying that the issue with incidents, it speaks to the need of having a business case for these things. And I think for the smaller companies, they can move without such big effort. They're not worried so much about a business case. They know people, and if it's a better working conditions for somebody they know, they can adopt it without the hassles. So the whole process, actually, in terms of the knowledge transfer and exchange, went very well. The opinion leaders went through their social networks, and CSAO, or the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, has a tremendous leverage in terms of the social networks they have. So the knowledge got out there. So it was very much a success, and we found a lot about how to do these innovations. There were some issues with it, though. I think one of the biggest issues when we talked to workers, the reason why there was a few identified incidents of MSDs in terms of not only this innovation impacts MSDs, but also it's a safety innovation as well, because people don't have to step on the bumper of the truck, and they're less likely to have injuries. So that's a good thing. So it's all pointing in the right direction. However, we don't see many lost time claims from this particular task, and the reason is that people aren't using the ladder lift a lot of time per day. And so for many tools we talk about in construction, in the next project I'll talk about the plumbing innovations, and those ones actually people are using a lot. This one is only used 5 or 7 or 8 times a day or something. Well, it's usually an even number because they get it off and put it back on to go home. But it's not, the use is, it's not a tremendous amount of their time. And so although the forces are high, if people are not injured, the long-term kind of risk for MSDs is not that great, because the exposure levels are the duration is not that long. So that, which leads to less chance of lost time claims, and that becomes the issue with the business case. I think in the future, doing these studies, including a business case analysis, especially if you could look at productivity. Again, a short time of use of the ladder, even though if it takes a bit longer, if you're only using it a few times a day, you get some increased productivity, but not that much. So if they're using it more often, you'd see bigger differences. So, anyways, the article kind of goes through some of the theory and how the findings matched up with what we'd expect if we do things according to Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory. And so it does give a nice model for doing that in construction and showing that actually with the right collaborators, it really can work. So on to the next one here. Another one of our case studies that I wanted to talk about, and Nikki's going to talk about another one in small business, getting it off the floor. This is a project on plumbing, and this was the beginning of an initiative. The previous Laderack study was really kind of the research team and the collaborative team taking, identifying and problem and doing an intervention and following it all the way through. This one was a little bit of a different approach. This one was really a response to a change in process. Remember, we were talking about tools, and what happened, when there was a change in the way plumbing was done in mainly residential low-rise construction, going from the more a way of using copper pipes for water lines to from copper to plastic. We see that there's a change in technology, and of course this change in technology is really related to speed of getting the job done. You could plumb a house a lot quicker with plastic PEX piping because it's flexible. You don't need to have so many joints in the plumbing, and it does change the process. And when PEX first came out, the old plumbers would swear by the copper is going to last all kinds longer, and the PEX leaks and all this stuff is not going to last as long. A lot of those issues have been resolved for this plastic piping, and it is really the piping that is very prevalent in most construction, certainly in Ontario these days. So anyways, this concern came out of, as Nikki thanked Local 46 in the GTA, this residential low-rise plumbers union. We worked very collaboratively with them through CRE-MSD. And the nice thing about CRE-MSD, we have all the expertise in terms of, we have a lot of expertise in terms of MSD prevention and ergonomics, and that's how we're all hooked up to Marcus Young, who's a professor now at in St. Louis, Missouri, and also to Richard Wells and folks up at the University of Waterloo who do a lot of biomechanical analysis, and so the issue here is increase use of this PEX plumbing, and also a rise in pain and difficulty in performing the job because of the effort required to do crimping. And so IHSA, or at that time the CSAO, was contacted, because of these issues. And again, Peter, collaborator on the project, and IHSA as this intermediary, who kind of helps link everything together. And so we come together for this project and really got to figure out, what are we going to do about this thing? So, and the issue is, here's the picture of the crimping. These things require a lot of force to do the crimping, and also there's an issue with we had some folks on our research team who are not big, huge people, and they had a real lot of difficulty even doing one crimp on that thing. The force required is it's great if you're into hand exercise all day long, but that causes a lot of fatigue. And Marcus Young did his whole PhD on this area of neuromuscular fatigue, and this was one of his projects for his part of his research program as well. So he was instrumental in doing some of the background work here. So we also interviewed workers, and we did surveys of workers, and they reported fatigue over a week, progressive loss of strength. When you're doing hundreds of these crimps a day, after 5 days, you can barely pick up a cup of coffee. So that's a problem with them. And you can imagine the effects after doing this for years of plumbing. So it's both the crimping and the cutting of the pipes when you're doing it a lot. So this is the results of the survey of the plumbers. We surveyed 186 low-rise residential plumbers with the help of the local to get this thing out. 94% reported pain after doing this job, so that's a lot of people. 80% reported back pain and 75% wrist pain. So we're also seeing back pain in this group as well. Awkward postures, working in these different awkward positions, causing back pain too. And we did some laboratory studies too, looking at grip force required for crimping. Marcus led those studies, and we do see that big grip force strength for crimping manually versus there's also a power crimper. That's the intervention here. Power crimping instead of a manual crimper. And from our survey, we see that we have a dose response between the number of crimps that the plumbers reported per day and the level of musculoskeletal pain, and that's a Borg scale, which is it's pretty high for pain, but we see a dose response. So part of this the study here was to look at what these plumbers actually do. And this is just a look at task analysis. The good thing about these plumbers is they do have some variation in the tasks, which gives them a break between these crimping operations. Unfortunately, it's when they do this crimping, they often fit out these pipes and do a lot of crimping all at once. So it can be pretty intensive when they're doing this stuff. So. But the good thing is they do have, as Nikki mentioned, workers in construction do have some control over their environment, which gives them the possibility to have some time away from these high exposures. Okay, so Marcus's work that he did show that we have this constant development of fatigue over the day and over the work week, and he looked at hand grip strength, tremor, and steadiness, and showed effects of related to fatigue over the weekend, and it takes some of the weekend to get back to it. Unfortunately, people don't get back 100% on Monday, but they're a lot better having a bit of time away from crimping. Weekends are good for people, I guess. That's the bottom line. We should take that into consideration. And the findings of Marcus's laboratory and studies in the field were consistent with what when we talked to plumbers, and also the survey results as well. So in the end here, this project was really about providing evidence that went back to the local union and was used to make a change, and the change was actually to the adoption of this tool. It's not, the tool is not without. This is the battery-powered crimping device that doesn't require the same force to operate. There's been some issues with that too. It's heavy. It's heavy and it's pretty expensive. And if you drop it, you lose a lot of money. So that's there's costs plus and minus with that. But overall, it does address these issues that we found in the study. So it did help in terms of making that innovation kind of diffuse into the plumbing trade in Ontario. So here's just some pictures of some of the devices out there. Just a quick summary of this. This was a case of a bottom-up innovation, where we have the local union that brings this up to researchers, and we collaborate through our intermediaries, the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, and it turned out to be quite successful. And there are some issues that Nikki talked about, not issues, but context that's there in terms of the union does have this social structure, and there is some power involved with that too, where they can do this bottom-up approach. It does work. So knowing that context is important for these innovations in construction. So, and I'm going to pass this over to Nikki, and she's going to talk about the last case study here. Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to quickly talk about a stored off the floor project, which was an idea of a graduate student, and we thought that we could develop a simple app that we could share with construction workers and other people to encourage them to store things off the floor, so there wouldn't be so much bending and there wouldn't be the same potential for low back injuries. What's interesting about this case study is that the original idea was a flop, and we were flexible enough to be able to modify our goals so that we in fact turned a flop into a success. And it was a flop because we at the university level assumed everybody had access to the internet all during the course of the day, and people would be interested in using apps, and this would be a great success and an easy way to transfer knowledge. The reality is that most workers in most workplaces do not have access to the internet during the course of the day. And even if they do have access to the internet, it's very limited, and they're only allowed to be in touch with their head office. So this notion that an app would be readily available to workers was disproven as soon as we started to talk to the workers. So the idea of developing an app that could teach them something about health and safety and that would be readily available just didn't make a lot of sense. And in addition to not having access, when we talked to a bunch of construction workers, they told us that the last thing that they would do when they went home at night is go on the internet looking for health and safety apps to give them some more information. So we decided to vary the goal about developing an app, and we decided to focus on small and micro companies and to work with them to see how we could share information that could improve their working conditions. So what we designed was a poster, a very simple poster, two-sided, showing people how to lift things and not lift things. And to put down information and to give them a way of doing a simple toolbox tool talk at the beginning of the day. The result is that the small and micro businesses showed limited knowledge about physical loading, and they were relying on ineffective proper lifting old techniques. The employers told us they needed a simpler knowledge transfer tool, such as a poster or tip sheets. The message needed to be delivered simply, and so that's what we did. That's why we designed the poster. The fact is, we did a sample of 40 small and micro businesses, and we used students over the course of the summer to do that. 2 or 4 weeks after the poster was given to these small companies, the students went back out and talked to the proprietors and the workers. And what we found out is that they learned a lot more about low back prevention than they hadn't even really thought about it. And we found that about 1/4, 25% of the businesses initiated some kind of change, so that they would have their heaviest material on the bottom. They introduced some shelving so that they put the stuff that they would use on a regular basis at waist or shoulder level. They tried to avoid putting heavy boxes above their heads. So these were all very small changes that they initiated, all which had the potential to reduce MSDs. And it was a simple message for a group of companies which employed the vast majority of Canadians, and they have the least access to health and safety information. Okay, so I think that it was an important activity. And the thing that was important for us to share with you is that when you start a project and it doesn't work, think about it, and maybe you just need to modify some of the things and you can turn a flop into a success. And I think that's what happened with that program. So I just want to go over really quickly what we learned about implementation. A lack of structure in a workplace is a barrier because you can't hold a class and, hold a class for half an hour on how to properly lift. And so to get a whole bunch of construction workers together is very difficult. But exposure to an open network is a facilitator. So we found, for example, with the ladder rack, that the plumbers were teaching the electricians, and the electricians were teaching some other group about different tools that they could use to improve their working conditions. And it's also critical that you try and avoid changes to the work process, so that there's a pattern, and if you can introduce an innovation into the process, the pattern of work, without changing the pattern of work, you're probably going to get more people to buy into it. The other thing is, though, that construction workers have significant power to organize their work. And so they can decide that they can do these things today and do these things later, which is a lot different than, say, a guy on an assembly line who has no choice on how things are going to be done. And so to give more power to workers to change the organization of how they do their jobs can provide a platform for change. And finally, small innovations are valuable to small and micro workplaces. And so just because it's not a fancy app doesn't mean that it can't save a worker's back, and that we should be willing to accept small changes to make major changes in the way people do their jobs. The other thing that we learned is that innovations, not all good ideas are usable. And so the potential for success of an innovation is that it will increase productivity. There's something to it that's bigger than just a safety improvement. Safety is not the most important factor when people decide to change things. The other thing is that people love to try things, and so experiential knowledge, the ability to try something, enhances the ability to introduce an innovation into a workplace. The innovation has to meet the specific needs of the subsector. The innovation was needed often and by many workers. So where we fell down on the ladder racks was that it wasn't something they were using all day long. If the innovation fits into the usual work process, it will probably be more accepted. And finally, if there's any bugs in the innovation, people will dismiss it. They'll probably try it a few times and then give up and go back to their traditional methods. We did a big study with Hydro Ontario, and we were using a tool to screw into the ceiling so people didn't have to go up and down a ladder. And we worked with the manufacturer and modified the tool to make it useful, because when we introduced the tool originally, it was not a success. And finally, not all good ideas are usable. The technique of transferring knowledge is really important. So just because you use the internet all day long doesn't mean that the people that are working in the real world have that same kind of access. And then it's important to understand that many of our trades and many of our workers are not literate learners. They don't learn by reading, they learn by looking and seeing and doing. And so KT, we shouldn't be dependent on written reports and studies to transfer knowledge. Posters are an excellent tool. Having coworkers introduce an innovation is very important because they have capital. They have social capital. People believe their coworkers more than they believe a bunch of academics from the university. It's important that innovations are supported by both labor and management. The other thing that's really important for knowledge transfer is that people are allocated time at work to try and learn things. And so if you're expecting people who've worked a 10 to 12-hour day to go home and then to participate in some kind of knowledge program, it's highly unlikely. So if you make half an hour a day during the course of the workday every month or so to learn about something new, you'll probably be much more successful in introducing an innovation. And there has to be an opportunity for people to meet with other people in different groups other than the simple workplace. So what we didn't do originally as well as we should have, and what we know now, is that we have to spend more time on planning innovations to make sure that they get implemented. And so you have to consider who the audience is, you have to consider the characteristics of the innovation, and you have to consider the organization of work if you want to successfully introduce an innovation into the workplace. So all of those three things have to be considered if you're a researcher or if you're a plant manager and want to make change. And you have to think about those things when you're designing your alternative methods of doing work.
Nikki
and I think
and
we're ready
Phil,
for questions.
thank you. I think we're ready for questions. We're actually very short on time because you had so much wonderful information to share. It's really encouraging, your presentation, because I think it gives us all some really great ideas on how we can implement change. I will just pass over the first question that came in, and that's related to the ladder study. Doesn't reducing strains from lifting ladders affect the overall strain on workers and make it less likely other strains will have a greater effect? Phil, does that make sense to you?
Well, it does. Yeah, I would say. Definitely. Again, though, the duration of exposure was fairly low in terms of the amount of time spent. So, yeah, I think overall, I think if you had a big enough population, you'll see effects on a population level just for that process that you're talking about. It's going to reduce, overall effort for the whole day of work. But because of duration, that's where we're limited there.
Okay. We had a question about, other than costs, what barriers prevent employers from implementing similar initiatives. And I think your chart as a start is really, really helpful. That comparison chart you had, some of those factors that you outlined there are really helpful for people to think about before they even start to look at change. And from this question, just wondering, did you get that chart from some other studies already? And were there other barriers that aren't necessarily identified in that chart?
I made up that chart, but I made it up from a whole bunch of research, and there's a lot of research now on comparing contingent work with traditional forms of work. But I can, if anybody wants, I can refer them to some literature on that subject. The changing world of work is a huge issue for researchers now because work is contingent. I mean, if we know that 30% of our workforce are on contract. And so there's a very good book written on this, Working Without Commitment, and by Wayne Luchuk from Mac and Master. And he talks about how there's not a commitment on the part of workers to an employer if they're only going to be there for 3 months. And the employer doesn't have the same kind of commitment to the worker. And we see that a lot in construction work and in just trying to learn new things. If you're going to be moving all around, you don't have the same kind of commitment. But we did find, for example, with the ladder racks and the plumbing tool, that the smaller employers were much more willing to introduce or accept those tools. But the smaller employers usually are only working with 1 or 2 guys who are their buddies. And so they have a stronger commitment to make sure that they don't get hurt and their buddies don't get hurt than a manager in an office who is far away from working
Thank you,
workplace.
Nikki. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we do have some questions that we're not able to address because we've run out of time, and they're really great questions. So we will, as we've promised, put these questions up so that everyone can see the answers to these questions. Again, sorry we ran out of time, and want to thank you for such a stimulating, very, very helpful, encouraging presentation. Have a great day, and thank you to all of you for joining us.
Phil and Nikki, I want to say thank you so much for your presentation, and Catherine, thank you so much for co-moderating this webinar. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your support.